when you're like in our case where we're targeting 12 languages, but I think we talked about this in the past, but you look at the number of people in our credits page now.
It's mostly localization people.
Butterscotch
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 485 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth, and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam, and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam, and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's September 11th, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for letting us grab your money to keep this podcast going. So today's a special day because we're doing a double. We're recording 2 episodes in the same day because something's about to go down.
Mm-hmm. I'm about to double up. We've got to add some more synergy, in the family unit. Double up on production of babies. We got a baby coming. Baby's coming.
Yeah, Sam's having a baby.
I can feel you trying to find your way there.
I was trying to find out how to do it. I don't know.
A little while back, Sam was reading up on everybody's talking about like declining birth rates and stuff, and Sam was like, "Not on my watch,
not in my house."
Totally.
So, see, he's saving us. He's saving us all. Thanks, Sam.
You're welcome.
Somebody's got to do it. I'm not doing it.
Someone's going to pay our Social Security.
That's true. That's why I'm making this baby. So yeah, I can be out for a little bit after the baby comes. So we're trying to get ahead of it on the podcast side of things, so that these 2 rascals, don't have to go on without me.
Yep.
We get to stockpile the good time and just sort of let it fly out over a longer period, which would be nice. So,
and if you're waiting for Crashlands 2 to come out, you might be wondering, but what does this mean for Crashlands 2 if Sam's capturing new humans, Mm-hmm. And the answer is, just some chaos, just a little bit of chaos introduced into the process. But we
just had to kind of reorganize our production plans. So like some stuff we kind of moved forward, other stuff we moved back.
But we're planning for it. We think we got it under wraps, and so now we're just waiting to see what happens.
Babies, though, is that they don't show up like instantly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you got some time.
It takes a while. You got some time. So you're prepping.
You can prep.
But you don't know for sure when they're going to show up, which adds a little chaos into the mix, And,
yes.
That's been the interesting thing. Because like we obviously, as we're wrapping up all the content in Crashlands 2, there's like a lot of like big quests or storylines or like things that kind of require a lot more collaboration and planning and integration. And those things are very hard to kind of like drop in the middle of working on them and then pick them up again later, right? And so now that we're kind of in this limbo state where it's like, baby could be here during during the podcast, Sam might have to get up and go, but it also might be next week. We don't know.
It might be later than even expected and be a week and a half or 2. It's just highly so we're working with our third party, like talking to Netflix, talking to our localization team, trying to keep them up to date with like, okay, here's what we think is happening. But every single update I've sent everybody now for the past like month is like best guess based on when the baby appears.
Yep.
As we think this is what's going to happen. We think these are the dates, but depending on exactly what actually happens, like, because also when you're in this part of development where it's like a lot of things are happening, we need to get to these kind of endpoints to move on to the next thing. And it's kind of all tied together. Then even if the difference is like a week of when suddenly we have to shift, that if that week falls on one side of a line versus the other side of a line, that might like dramatically change
some stuff,
a whole bunch of other stuff. So a lot of it's just kind of like, we're just gonna see what happens.
Yeah, we're still at a point where it's like there's enough stuff to wrap up in other parts of the game that it seems like it's almost more just like moving some stuff around, basically, but within the same kind of bucket of time. So,
well, there was a pretty fun thing though, where like we were looking at our time because like localization is always kind of the tricky one because it has to happen after everything exists, right? And it takes a long time because it's a huge game with I don't know how many words we're going to end up with, but a lot. Not a
estimate
novel,
is
big fat novel.
120,000.
Yeah. So I think more than double probably what original Crashlands had.
4,000, I think, or something like that.
I think by the time we were done with Crashlands, there are 2 numbers that stick out in my brain. One was 60 and one was 80,000 words. Because we also had some like post-launch updates and some other stuff that happened. So I can't remember for sure, but like we're sitting on the like almost double to almost double kinds of scale for Crashlands 2.
Yeah, and of course we didn't localize the original Crashlands until long after launch, even then just in one language, right? And so it's been an interesting practice here. And it's been pretty different from Levelhead too, because like when we worked on Levelhead, it was a much smaller game in terms of text, right? Much fewer words because this wasn't so story driven. But we were able to kind of like get things translated in a way that we could do it a lot more like piecemeal, a lot more continuous because
it was a story based, so you don't have quite as much like there's not as much like integrated stuff. Right?
Like if you've got this item that you don't have a name for it yet. And you don't have a name for it because you still have to figure out what its recipe is. And then like what it's made of will kind of dictate the name. But then you want to have a quest about that item. Then you'll put like a placeholder name in the quest. And it's like, well, if you try to translate any one of those things like midstream, then you just fucked because then you'll have to retranslate it anyways because you're going to change it.
I feel like Crashlands 2 has been a really interesting dev journey of figuring out how to like chunk really complex stuff together in a way that lets you actually, finish pieces of it. Like actually finish them and move forward. And the localization is like it's the end point of all of these things. Like
it's kind of a forcing function, right? Because
it is. Yeah,
I think our natural tendency is to kind of work on all of it until the whole thing is suddenly done. Like that's kind of like that's how we want to work on this stuff. Because it allows you this like huge free reign where it's like, oh, I want to go like update this thing back here. I want to try to like scaffold out kind of the whole thing as a draft, but then like kind of fill up details here, then come back and edit the main thing once I've found it. It just kind of keeps on going where you're just kind of filling up that space. But these other aspects of development, so things like sending builds to your publishing partners or putting a demo out or doing a beta test so that people need to have an accurate kind of a gameplay experience to give you useful feedback. Like these kinds of things basically force us to instead take an approach of like, we need something that is done, quote unquote.
And so you got to wrap that thing up, but also like you got to wrap up anything that relates to it because
so that you know the answers.
Because the translators need the context, the full context of the thing. Yeah. And so like with Sam's sort of somewhat predictable, but also somewhat unpredictable absence coming up here, it kind of forced us to take a look at all of our timelines, and we found some pretty interesting things that we could do that would actually like just by rearranging a few different orders of operations of things. Then we gave ourselves like an extra month of dev time in the same window that we were originally planning on getting stuff wrapped up. Which is great because things always feel tight, and when it's like finding a bunch of money in the couch cushions. This was here all along. We just didn't look hard enough. So that's pretty cool. It's been interesting,
and it kind of does mean that the way that we have to wrap up the game is by trying to get ahead on the text parts, so user interfaces and all the quests and stuff. Yeah. And because what we want to be able to do is be like, well, the quests are done. And to make the quests, we have like the art assets for the items involved. And we've got the creatures. Like we want to be able to see all of the things to help inform like how the quest text works and that kind of stuff. But it's kind of that realization that like, well, if we need all that stuff to be done at the same time to get the text done, then kind of the whole game has to be done for the text to also be done. And then at that point, then we submit to our final localization round.
And then you just sit there for six plus weeks.
Yeah, because what was kind of what we saw with the demos, it took basically 4 weeks for localization and localization QA with the first 45,000 words in the game.
So the first act.
Yeah. I mean, we're assuming the total game is basically 3x that in total. So we're like, okay, that's another just 8 weeks of loc time. And if we can't do that in parallel with development somehow, then that means that the game has to be done with an extra 2 months before launch, right? So try to figure out how to layer that in.
And what do you do in that 2 months? Because you can't add anything to the game.
You can't add any
text in it.
That's the idea, is like to make it so that now by the time we submit the final loc round or the final major one, because we can put out some final little requests for updates. But by that time, the idea is like, okay, well, the art won't be done. There's a whole bunch of like quality of life programming things with the actual like gameplay experience. There's bugs and performance. There's a whole bunch of stuff that still has to happen. It's just being like, okay, even though some of that stuff we want to do now because it feels bad to not have that stuff done, we really need to actually do that once all the
need
work.
to front load anything that touches text, basically. So it's been interesting to kind of see how you could, like, just by reordering a few things and like creating certain deadlines or wrap up points, then you can get way more stuff done in the same amount of time because you no longer are waiting for things, right? And like we've talked in the past about DevOps a lot and how waiting is one of those types of waste that just really hits people a lot in ways that it's hard to overstate just how bad it is. You know, like waiting for stuff just fucks up everything. And so if you can rearrange things just a little bit so that you're just not waiting for things anymore, not waiting for so many things.
Yeah, it's all about making things parallelizable, you know.
Yep.
But and that is the other piece of like one of the core principles of DevOps is small batch deliveries, right? But there are certain kinds of things where you don't really have that as an option, you know, and Loc is that big one because for translators to do their job, they need so much context. Everything needs to be kind of coherent collectively. And when you're like in our case where we're targeting 12 languages, then you got to like wrangle all these people and like try to get it done at the same time. And they have to like find time on their schedule because we can't afford to have that stuff in-house because our team would be like 5 times bigger just to handle localization. Like, if you look, like, I think we talked about this in the past, but you look at the number of people in our credits page now.
It's mostly localization.
It's almost entirely localization because for each language, there's like 2 translators, 1 tester, and
project
a reviewer, and there's a few project managers, and there's
just like each language is the same number of people as our whole team, and there's like 12 languages.
So when you're dealing with stuff like that, like it's not possible to do it in small, like continuously. But even if you're doing that during development when you're just like constantly changing stuff, then you're just spending a lot of extra money just like paying for people to re-edit things over and over and over again. And so it's like it's a budget balancing problem. It's a huge just like human management problem. And it's a lot. It's really bad. And you don't want to leave it to the end because then you're
you do. You got to leave it to the end of
as long as
you don't want to leave you don't want to leave all of it to the end. You want to try to figure out how to do it in batches that are measurable. So since we're doing kind of 2 episodes, then we're going to try to focus a little bit more on questions, I think. But we do want to talk about a couple of little nail whiff, a little bit of games industry discussion. So we might not even get to any questions this episode. We'll see.
If you're newer to the podcast, we have a segment that we do very randomly and frankly rarely, which is the Nailed It, Whiffed It, which is our review mechanism, which is to say, did a game accomplish what it set out to do, which is independent of whether or not we liked it. And so if it did, then it nailed it. And if not, then it whiffed it. And whether we like it is just some additional stuff that's interesting.
That's just a matter of opinion.
Yep.
So let's talk about Balatro, which I didn't know anything. I never heard of, but apparently I'm the only one.
I am impressed that you hadn't. Yeah, I'm impressed that you hadn't even heard of it because you also like spent some time on like Reddit, like with seeing like gaming subreddits and stuff too, right? Like,
I have filtered out the gaming subreddit years ago.
Okay,
I don't look at that. I don't look at that thing.
So maybe you've managed to, because actually, I guess it hasn't been like I don't know. I guess I've seen it in like I feel like I've seen it in the news press also. In any event, Balatro, we're a little late to the party talking about it, but we're kind of late to the party playing any game these days, you know. So. So Balatro, it's a deck building roguelike where the gimmick is the deck you're building is a regular ass card deck and the game that you're playing is regular ass poker. Except that.
So in a way, poker is a deck building roguelike.
Yes,
exactly.
Okay.
So in that way, except that it has then the trappings of like what you would think of for a deck building roguelike, where you basically you make money depending on how well you do on the hand and if you win, right? And you're just playing until you lose. And once you lose, start over, right? And how well you win kind of dictates how much gold you get. And you can use that to buy jokers. And jokers have special abilities. And you can also use that to buy other kinds of cards, all random, of course, that you can use to like level up the cards in your hand or level up how many points you get when you get a full house or or convert like some set of cards to a different set of cards, which is it's like my favorite run that I had. I ended up getting lucky with a few of the things that I drew randomly. And I went with like a hearts deck. So I had like just way more hearts than you're supposed to, in the thing, and also like way more of like some of the high cards because I managed to convert like a bunch of 3s to kings, and so it's like that. It's that kind of weird shit, right? So that it becomes this unpredictable.
You start with a regular deck of cards, and then it just kind of
starts to deviate.
So I got to say something about this because this is something that I wish there was more of, which is taking games that people are really familiar with, like board games or tabletop games or card games, and essentially making a spin-off or a sequel of it. It's like one of the games that I'm the most proud of that I made, which has not even seen the light of day. Like I made it, and then I was like, I don't know what to do with this really. Is I made a chess game. Have I talked about this before? Did I made a chess game?
Podcast? I don't think so.
So I made a chess game. I can't remember what I called it, but in my mind I was laughing about it. It's like it's Chess 2.
Yeah, I
like
think you were calling it Chess 2. But there are other games out there that people call Chess 2. So it would have had to eventually have a different name, but I think you were calling it Chess 2.
Yeah. And so the idea was like it starts as it's a normal chessboard, but then every piece has one extra thing that it can do. So like normally, a pawn will move up 1 or up 2, and then it attacks diagonally 1 space, right? And in this game, like the pawn also had an ability where it could drop a smoke bomb on the space in front of it, which would block anything from going to that space for like 2 turns or something like that.
Yeah.
Or another one would be able to like drop an item on the board where any piece that touches that item would then trade places with the dropping piece, including enemy pieces, right? And of course, it consumes your turn to do that. And so you got to be careful that you don't accidentally set up your opponent in a way that they can then like use that thing later to fuck you over. And like there were all kinds of just adding in like one extra thing for each piece to do. It suddenly just like made things insanely layered, you know?
Well, it's interesting because you take a game that is well known, or at least conceptually, like,
and already pretty complex in terms.
Yeah, it's already complex, but you don't have to teach it for the most part, right? Or if you do, it's like a simple, like a shorthand for it. You don't have to teach people what a deck of cards is. Like, you'd imagine that. Like, if it's just, here, every new card you see is like, what is a 2? I don't even know what a 2 is. Why is it a heart?
Yeah, like we all learned it at some point, and we were like, what the fuck is this, right? But then eventually it just kind of sinks, and you're like, oh, sure,
so
I know what an ace is. I know what a king is.
I think what's most impressive about it, though, with Balatro, because I just played the demo during the Next Fest, which is, I think, when I picked up a lot of Steam. Pun. But
it is on Steam.
It's on Steam. But the thing I found most interesting about it was like the choices you can make when you're taking an existing game. So like you're saying, Seth, with chess, where it is that you decide to take liberties, right? In the case of a game like Balatro, where it's like, you could just convert cards in the deck into other fucking cards. Like there's other things that you're just doing stuff that like.
Yeah, which is great because like poker's already about lying and bullshitting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so like people will use their knowledge of kind of like statistics of what's going on in the deck, right? To try to discern whether or not your opponent is lying, whether they have a good hand, stuff like that. But in a lot of cases, in poker, people will use like multiple decks put together to dilute the statistics so that it's harder to know those things, right? And so this just kind of takes you to another level, which is like, once you've got all these crazy things that people can do, then there's going to have to be like a lot more of that kind of like mind games.
It's smart because it's single player and you're only playing against a score, right?
Yeah,
so
it's just a score keeper.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's no multiplayer.
So they have all these really clever design decisions that just make it so that the game works super well, but also is so smartly designed from just making the game kind of a standpoint, So all told, it comes together to a very clear nailed it, in my opinion. Because like any given run, like my first few runs were amazing and I felt so good and I was like so overpowered.
I'm the best.
And my next 5 sucked, but it's got enough of that.
Now you're just gonna chase that high.
Yeah, you gotta just chase. It ends up being exactly that, and it's very cleverly designed from a game design standpoint. It's a cool game to go play and like think about, to be like, why does this all work so well together? I think it's a very cool, just like study that. So definitely nailed it. And the main reason I'm thinking about it is because I saw the news that they're coming to mobile September 26th or something like that. I don't know what the details are. I think it's just straight up coming to mobile. I don't think it's in like a particular service or anything.
Well, sign me up.
But I was, because when I first heard about it and heard people talking about it, I wanted it on mobile because it just felt like being able to pull out my phone and just like play a few hands, felt like exactly perfect mobile game kind of construction. So I was bummed at first, but they got it out onto mobile pretty quick after their Steam launch. So.
Yeah, it's only been a couple months, right?
Yep.
They came out.
And I don't know if they were originally planning to, because it's one of those things like it's all well done. Like the person who made it did a solid job top to bottom, but I can't tell. It doesn't feel like something that they thought like, ooh, this is going to be like something I can, bring to mobile and do those. It kind of felt like a classic indie title in the sense like somebody made it, hope for the best, and that it just turned out to blow up, right? And so,
well, especially I think when you're making a game that is that like it's weird. It's a weird game. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it's specific and it's weird. And I think so. Whenever you're making something like that, you're in that probably that headspace of like, okay, this is either gonna do like okay, hopefully it does well enough. It's kind of like the usual thing, but you're never expecting it to like fucking. I don't know how many
and especially because we were making the point earlier that like building something interesting on top of an existing game can let you do a lot of cool stuff that otherwise is really hard to do. However, that space is very occupied, right? There's tons, like there's infinite solitaires, of course, right? But there's also infinite variations on like kinds of solitaire and solitaire-like things and poker-like things. And so that's the other part of this is like that standing out from the rest of that crowded space is pretty remarkable. And like if I was that dev, I would not have expected that either.
There's a lot. It's a lot of courage in that, right? Because the decision. So again, we're talking about like, okay, we're going to sit down and design a game. From the jump, you can ask the question like, who's it for? Who is a poker roguelike for? Because if you said it's for people who like playing poker, it's like, well, they're playing poker.
Yeah, they'll just play. Yeah,
they're good.
Why would they do this?
If it's for people who play roguelikes, like deck builder roguelikes, it's like, do they want to play poker though? And I think it's one of those ones where I feel like if you got this as a business pitch, like a investor pitch or something, it would be. Well, frankly, I think it'd be not obvious at all that you should say like, yeah, let's put some money on it. But
really, this is just like what we talked about last week when we were talking about that Fellowship game, right? Where it's like, if you're gonna make something that resembles what's already in the space, then it has to have something going on that you can't get in either space. And it has to be accessible in a way that people can just get right in there and see how cool it is and like see that appeal right away, right? So it sounds like they nailed that.
100%. Yeah. 100%.
So nailed it. Balatro. Balatro.
Yeah, it's on Steam and coming to mobile end of this month.
Yeah.
All right. And we also had Shogun Showdown.
Yeah. So I picked this up just like a couple days ago, and I'm a big fan of roguelikes, also a fan of deck builders, whatever. And this one's interesting because it's a turn-based tactics game. But usually when you say that, what comes to mind is probably like more of like a top-down angle or something like that, and like a grid,
like an XCOM or something.
Yeah, something like that. But instead, this one is you take the role of essentially like a samurai or something. You're traveling across the land. You get in these battles, but the way they're all handled is you have a few of these tiles, they call them, that are essentially your moves. So it's kind of like a card, right? Has a cooldown, does a certain amount of damage, whatever. But the tricky part is that the board that you're playing on is not a grid, top down. It's just a single row. Your character's just standing there, and you can choose to move, left or right. You can turn around as part of your, actions, and then you queue up abilities, and then you right click to trigger them, right? So similar to what Adam was saying about like when you look at a game, you're playing a game, and you're looking at it, and you're like, this is very clever. Like the whole thing is very fucking clever as far as how they stitch it all together. Where what you end up with, I mean, you can see it on the playtime. Like some people have like 60 hours in this thing, and it's like a pixel art. Like so far, I've unlocked like a character, and I maybe played for like a couple hours. And the depth that you get out of it is just tremendous. They have all sorts of weird enemies that do all sorts of stuff. You get like little shadow dash moves that you like zip behind people and lightning bolts, all sorts of weird shit. But I think critically, the reason why I would say this is another nailed it recommendation is that they nail the feeling of like managing to be like almost like John Wick. It makes you feel like John Wick. Like you're in a room basically with like 5 of these people who are attacking you, and you sort of like you work them against each other. They can hit each other, right? Their abilities can hit each other. You can swap positions with them and stuff like that. And so like it makes you, when you execute like a really good like moment in it, it makes you feel like a fucking ninja. Like it makes you feel like the thing, right?
you describe this makes me think. You see that Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr.
where he always just like looks around and then
he'll be in a fight or something, and they kind of played up the idea that like, oh, Sherlock Holmes is like has this incredibly quick analytical mind, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's an incredible fighter in these movies because it's like for him, it's like time freezes or goes into like turbo slow motion, and he's looking around quickly, like calculating all these different things he can do.
He's
and then
using VATS.
Yeah, and then he'll just do like 3 moves, and suddenly everybody explodes. You know, like
So it feels like that, and I think it's one of those interesting things where when I got the game because it has overwhelmingly positive and like a couple thousand reviews. It came out like a week ago, which is absolutely fantastic for a indie title, right? And so I was looking at it, I was like, well, you know, I like these kinds of games, but I don't quite understand what's going on here. But I'll try it, and if it's not good, just refund it, whatever. And the fact that it's like, I guess looking at it and the art's good, everything's like the music is great, but it's because it's not like trying to make you look like John Wick in like a 3D space doing the stuff. It doesn't necessarily tell you how effectively it's going to emotionally deliver on that sensation of like feeling like a badass, like martial artist, quote unquote, because you're just like, you just do your sort of set of things and kill everybody all of a sudden.
That's the problem we talk about with trying to sell games, right? Is the only way to actually understand what a game feels like is experientially. There's no way of conveying what it's going to feel like to play it in any other way.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's interesting. There's a gap, right? Sometimes it's actually not very big. So I can play God of War, for example. Yeah. You could kind of feel it by looking at it. Like it's not really abstracted, like beating stuff up, right? This one's, it's so weird because it's much more abstracted in terms of it's this turn-based like tile thing. But they somehow managed to do it. And I was like, this is fantastic. So
yeah.
Nailed it. That reminds me of a game.
Showdown.
Shogun Showdown. That reminds me of a game I haven't played yet, but I've heard talked about that seems really cool. For a future episode, maybe called Tactical Breach Wizards.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that sounds dope.
It sounds awesome. Like my understanding is it's like you're playing like as magical wizards, right? But like every little level,
team, right?
Yeah, your magical SWAT team. So every like level is just, it starts with you bursting down a door and doing a tactical breach into some space. Mm-hmm.
But with wizards.
And the review that I read of it was like, you would think that like every level starting with like you just blowing open a door and going through it would eventually like the gimmick would fade. But they were like every single time it was so satisfying. It felt so good. So yeah, I got to try that one out, but I haven't played it out.
All right. So those are some pretty good recommendations. And I've been playing the new WoW expansion, which so far has nailed it, but I'm going to hold off on discussing anything else about it and making a final nail in the coffin. You know, I'm going to give it a couple more weeks because it is a giant MMO with a huge end game, and it kind of lives or dies by not like what happens in the first couple of weeks, but what it's like to play it in the longer term.
It's the epitome of the idea when you go to Steam and you see that like played 1,000 thumbs down, played 1,000 hours. You know, it's
because you got to know that it sucks by putting that time in. Exactly. You know, but so far a lot of hype about it. It's getting very good responses from people, and there's been some really good design philosophy changes in there that I think are bearing out nicely. So we'll see. I'll kind of break that down some more.
Did you guys ever play Satisfactory? I just saw I hit 1.0 this week. Like it's been in early access for 5 years.
Oh my God.
For 5 years I just went.
It was on the Epic. Is it on the Epic Store only, or
it was?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't remember. I think I remember something about it with the Epic Store.
It was. I think it was exclusive.
They only did 1 year exclusives though, or I think like 6 months to 1 year, depending on the game. So it's got to be on Steam at this point.
Yeah, it's on Steam for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe check that out too. It looks pretty dope.
Yeah. There's a few games like that like everybody who knows me at all is like, you should really play this game. Like you'd be into it. And that's one of those that I still just haven't touched yet. But that news that it hit 1.0, I was like, okay, I probably just got to make myself sit down and give this thing a shot.
Yeah. Although Adam, I feel like you have kind of an interesting relationship with games because you have like this really analytical mind and you love to deep dive stuff, but you know that. And because of that, you kind of avoid games that are too deep because you know that you'll just
I like pretty brain dead games. I like shooting zombies. You know, give me just let me shoot some zombies. So I don't have to think that hard, and just blow off some steam. But yeah, well, the more I have to start thinking about it, the more I'm like, this is turning into a whole thing. You know, and yeah.
So thanks.
Yeah, you got to know yourself, you know, know your, which is why we do nail whiff, right? It's not like, should you play it? It's like, well, just, you know, we don't know. You decide whether you should play it. All right, let's get into some questions. These questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net. Highest upvoted question comes from Gibbs, who says, in the current games market, do you guys ever consider how a game will look on a live stream, YouTube, or other social media? Does it affect your design process at all?
I will say we did more of the what you'd call marketing first development with Crashlands 2, which is just the essentially trying to nail an overall like visual aesthetic thing, putting a lot of work into that basically up front, where there was no game really still, but you had
basically the first year.
Yeah, we're really figuring out everything from the new pipe. It was in our case, it was a lot of things stacked on top of each other because it was a whole new pipeline for art, new programs, new animation capabilities, everything. So there's a bunch of, it wasn't just the figuring out what the art looked like. It was figuring out how to do art in that new context.
And how the lighting engine is going to work in the game. And
yeah.
But it wasn't for the purpose of like thinking of streaming and stuff or like people playing the game live. It was basically because the idea, like what we just said earlier, right? Which is you can only get a game if you experience it. And so the goal for marketing a game is how do you get as close to that as possible given the limitation there. Right. And video is the thing. That's how you get as close to possible to the actual experiential part. And so our motivation was primarily about like however people see it, assuming they're going to see screenshots and videos are like the primary drivers of whether or not people get into it. And that could be in a stream or it could be a trailer, but either way, it's mostly about like making sure that the visual presentation at all times looks like something you want to get it, like you want to get in there. You want to get into that environment.
Yeah, I do think, and it is a little bit different from like the streamer-oriented approach, which I know typically is more, it's going to be not just on the art, but that's actually oftentimes a more design-directed one. So that's like, I know in Cult of the Lamb, for example, they did a really good job with this, which is that they did integration with Twitch chat such that like your followers, which makes sense, right? It makes perfect sense actually in a cult, so like a cult simulator, that you could essentially have your chat people, you know, become your followers, and then chat could like also vote on stuff that was happening, you know, like as if they were the cult, stuff like that, which worked great. But that doesn't line up usually for most games, to be honest. Like,
no, you need stuff where it doesn't matter because the stuff where like there's outside influence is kind of random on a game. Mm-hmm. It's good for like roguelikes and stuff where there's like a reset point and it doesn't matter that much if things get out of hand. It doesn't work well for like long form single player titles necessarily, you know?
Yeah.
But also this stuff is really costly. It's really dev and design costly to be like, okay, I actually do want the design of this game to be able to incorporate like some aspect of the Twitch API. So I can figure out like what is coming up with an interesting, compelling idea for like how streamers and their communities are going to interact together through the medium of your game with this like async aspects related to that. And it's if you're going to go down that route, you have to have high confidence that it's worth doing, right?
I got to say, this is a personal bias because like I don't know everything, and like we were saying earlier, we don't follow most games because there's a trillion of them, and we also have other things that we're doing. But in my experience, especially around the time that like Twitch really started taking off, when everybody was talking about Twitch integration, and like how do you make your game more appealing to Twitch streamers by like adding stuff to your game that hooks up to the Twitch API so that their audience can like do stuff within, like interact with them through the game, you know, like vote on like summoning enemies to fight them or whatever. I haven't ever seen that bear out in a way that mattered.
I think it's important to note that it's one of those things that if the game is already successful and you have a good implementation of this, then it will act as some kind of a bonus, like some kind of a bonus multiplier. But the game has to already be successful.
Yeah, like you're not going to have like an average, like kind of mediocre game and then throw this like Twitch integration in it. And then like, because people can interact with a Twitch streamer, suddenly people will start streaming it.
Right.
Like that's not really how
that goes.
You
can design a game to be played by like people on stream, right? So you have stuff like
so
that
less
chained together.
interactive, but
but more where it's like more designed essentially for that crowd of people, where it makes good content by itself. And I think that kind of consideration is actually should and is kind of always there, even for us, where it's like,
well, because it's it's kind of the same consideration that you have for any of marketing, right? Which is like the idea that a streamer can treat your game as content is kind of the same idea as somebody can like watch a trailer of your game and be like, this looks interesting, right? Like it's kind of the same. It's not identical, but it's a very overlapping set of problems.
Like there's like Baldur's Gate, I think, has a Twitch integration thing where it'll hook into your Twitch account, and if you're streaming it, then people in your chat can vote on what you should answer in dialogue options.
Nice.
Sure.
I've seen I don't actually watch like people live streaming Baldur's Gate, but like I've seen just probably at this point hundreds of videos of people playing Baldur's Gate, like playthroughs, weird tricks, clips, stuff like that. I've never seen anybody use that, right? Because it's like all they have to do is just go, "Hey chat, what do you think I should do here?" And people will be like, and then people just throw their answer into the chat, and then the person like will still just be, they'll just take it under advisement, but do whatever is like kind of fun because like so often what the chat does is they troll the streamer.
Yeah.
And that gets so predictable that you might as well just pick the worst option because like that's what the chat was going to ask you to do. Right.
Well, I think
so like, it doesn't really change much.
Yeah. That's where to me, there's a difference between like designing for like integration in the case of like trying to come up with something for chat to do versus just designing a game to be streamable in the sense
to be
of
fun to stream.
Yes. And that's where there's a whole bunch of games that like live in that category. You got like there's like that trigger warning or content warning, I think, game.
I mean, Among Us.
Even Among Us. Yeah. Among Us has
every horror game.
Every horror game. And then that most recent one I saw, which is like you're chained together. Two people are chained together. You gotta like get through like hellish maze thing. Like all of those are great conceptual like concept pieces for, this would make interesting and funny content for these like personalities to play. I think the thing is like I couldn't say it's honestly even more of a risk than doing anything else in games because the whole thing's so fucking risky. So whatever. But like it's just a different path.
Well, and here we are just being like, oh, like this doesn't really do anything, doesn't work. We don't know. Like there's a chance that tomorrow some game just blows up on Twitch because it has Twitch integration and in a way that we hadn't thought of or seen before, and it just goes, right?
Well, I think it's one of those like it's if you're in kind of a make or break situation, so like if your game is going to stand on its own, then something that makes it compelling to streamers and that kind of stuff is potentially going to help, right? To make the end effect bigger because just more visibility, more coverage, so more people know about it. But that wasn't the difference between like it was successful and it wasn't. There are these cases though where because there's especially with like little like smaller indie titles and stuff because there's just so many of them that there's that little subset that like couldn't have taken off because it's too hard to be seen, right? Where there's enough of a compelling kind of gameplay experience for streamer content that if a big enough streamer picks it up, that makes the difference between nobody seeing it and at least a sizable chunk of people seeing it. Usually those things still don't turn into something like big, but I think there is that little like space there that there is a make or break kind of phenomenon with streaming. But I think for the most part, it just like maybe helps a bit.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting the way this question is framed as like, do you consider how a game will look in streaming or YouTube or social media? Which I haven't really thought about that as like a distinct difference between just like how visually appealing is the game in general, like for when we make trailers or whatever. I mean, it is something that we've focused on a lot of, which we've talked about in the past, of trying to elevate certain aspects of the visuals of the game so that people are less dismissive of it. Because like this is something that we have to kind of deal with as a 2D game studio. Is a lot of people kind of have an inherent bias against 2D games, hand-drawn animations or whatever, that doesn't really exist for 3D. Like you just don't hear people be like, yeah, I don't play 3D games. Unless it's like, they say like, oh, I don't play first-person games because I get motion sick, which is a different kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, right.
Nobody's like, I don't play 2D games because they make my eyes hurt. Like they just view them as like not as sophisticated or not as deep or something as 3D games. And so we kind of have to push against that by trying to knock it out of the park with the visuals, try to make things really, vibrant and stunning and engaging and interesting looking so that we kind of like break down that barrier. Right. But
Yeah,
I'm not really sure what the difference would be, like a focusing on like making it look good on social media versus just like making it look good.
Well, I think for streaming, that kind of stuff, it's that next layer above it, which is it's like you're kind of like zooming out a bit and you're saying not how do I make the game look good, but are there things that I can do about the design of the game so that somebody playing it, using it as content for their own audience. Because there are no really good streamers who literally just play a game. That's not how that works, right? They're providing commentary, talking with their community. And they're creating this bridge between their experience in the game and like their viewer experience. And it's actually about the streamer. It's not about the game. And so a game that actually tries to take that into account is trying to provide some levers for the streamer to pull to make it so that they create experiences for their community.
Yeah,
right.
That's where you see like a lot of the
through the game.
Adam mentioned like horror games oftentimes, but like anything where there's basically surprises and ragdoll physics are like your two big.
Yeah, people are not watching those streams for the horror game itself. They're watching it to have fun watching somebody get scared, and react to it. Yeah.
Well, in a way, it's kind of similar to like you can. And this is something that I've kind of gotten into where like you can rewatch a show yourself, or you can watch somebody react to the show for the first time, which is it's essentially the closest you can get to re-experiencing the show for the first time, right? And at that point, it's not really about the show. It's about like wanting to relive that feeling of what it felt like to watch the show.
Or at least share the experience in some way, right? Because that's also a different thing than like if you recommend something to somebody that you thought was really great, they synchronously go off and experience it and then tell you, yeah, that was really great, right? That's a very different experience than like sitting down with somebody, in real life synchronously or watching somebody, but it feels like you're sitting down in real life with them and watching them experience the same thing that you think is really cool and interesting and getting to have that shared experience. I think all those come into play, like all those different ways that because you basically have to try to evaluate like what are the reasons that people watch that kind of content. And it's not about the games. The games are a vehicle by which and this is also why we're so skeptical about a lot of like influencer marketing, that kind of stuff, because that stuff doesn't translate into game sales actually that effectively. Like it does, especially if there's a huge streamer or if that streamer and their community are like all about games actually, less and not as much about like the
and we don't control it. I mean, look at how many times like studios have tried to like make their game into an esport. Yeah. Right. And it just, which really comes down to streaming. Like something being an esport is like it has to be popular enough and visible enough that like the people want to watch it a bunch because like that's where the money comes from sports and esports is from viewers, not from the players, right?
It's from advertising dollars.
Yeah, and so like I like we've seen over the years, dozens and hundreds of studios try to make a game, make it into something that would be like just primed to be a viewable esport experience. And then nobody plays it and nobody streams it. I
don't know. It's so tricky, like all of it. You could really design for any one of these things, but somehow just
you don't get to decide what happens after that.
That's what. Yeah, ideally, you're trying to like accomplish all of it at the same time, which is impossible for any given game design. So you're kind of choosing which things you're focusing on, right? And for us, our general belief is that all this stuff is useful, but there's nothing we can like intentionally do besides make a really good game that looks really good in trailers and screenshots. Like that has to always be our primary focus because that's the top of the funnel for anything else that could possibly happen. And most other things that we do beyond that, if they're really costly to do or they directly impact the design in ways that we don't like or whatever, the chances of them paying off in a way that was big and worth it are just small. Yeah. Sometimes they do, and if we can do a little bit of it, that's always the best case. Like if you can do just enough somehow, that's always the best case scenario. But ideally the game design itself just kind of stands alone. And again, I think this is why I think the horror genre is so good because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything for the purpose of streaming. It's just that watching people experience a horror product is inherently fun and hilarious.
That's so good.
And so like no horror game has to do anything extra.
I do want to mention in this regard. There's that game, I think it's called like No Screaming or something like that. Did you see this? The horror game? So you want to talk about one that is like built for like watching someone react to. Basically, you use a mic with it at all times. And this fucking thing, it's spooky as fuck. But like you crash somewhere that you get out of a plane and you're trying to just make your way to, like, I don't know, safety. But they are just throwing infinite jump scares at you the whole time. You cannot, like, you'll just be walking and like a giant fucking spider just comes zooming up and like, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't kill you. Nothing kills you. But like, oh my God, it's so terrifying. And people playing it's hilarious watching people play it because you're trying to not make a fucking
probably like that game like that is probably like 100 times more fun to watch somebody play than it is to play.
Oh, 100%. That's exactly what I thought. I was like, this is one of those things where, like, I'm not going to buy it because like, I don't want to experience that, but it's great TV. You know what I mean?
But a game like that is one of those situations where people streaming the game may be making more money than the people who made the game.
That's actually true. I'm curious about that one. I'm not sure how well it did. I know it got picked up by everybody for a bit there, but like I don't know how.
Yeah,
if that
but it only takes
sales,
like one person to buy it and stream it, and then like 10,000 people watch that. And if all of them have the same opinion, which is like, oh, this is really fun to watch, but I'm not going to play it.
I think that is the downside of horror games is that most people don't like to play horror games. There's just like with horror movies, there's a subset of people who fucking love that shit, right? And they're there for it. But it is a niche genre, and I think you're probably right that at least to some extent for certain titles, watching other people experience them is what the majority of people want. So that, and again, this goes back to the idea that like, again, the content you're getting isn't the game. It's when you're watching a streamer, it is the streamer is providing that content. And so the idea that streamers sell games, I still think is mostly just not true. Again, I think they probably help to an extent. And there are
in some cases,
there are going to be examples where like they definitely helped in a lot. But I think like the average outcome is like mostly your game is just content for somebody else, for influencer kind of marketing.
Well, no, Adam, they're the content creators,
Yeah, and they are. We're both the content creators, right? Because we created the content that they used to make
collaborators.
Yeah, it's just both true. But it is, and I don't know. It's one of the things that when we're talking to like influencer marketing people and stuff, we're trying to figure out like, is it worth? Because it's also really expensive. Because they get to hand off to you and be like, look, our videos get seen by 500,000 people on average or whatever, right? And you're like, so therefore I could charge you X, right? Because they're basically kind of charging like per view kind of a metrics, right?
Like it's an ad, basically.
Yeah, but if you want to go down that hole of being like, okay, well, what is the actual outcome on like sales of the thing? And as soon as you get into that question, the answer is always, well, we don't know, but probably something, So
yeah, because all they know is how many people saw it. That's all they can sell you is just like people will see it. Yeah. Whatever happens next is just that's between you and God.
And we do. I mean, to be fair, again, like it's not that they have no effect. Like we've had big videos.
Oh yeah, they have an effect.
It's that the size of the effect compared to like what it would cost you to buy that sort of
time
experience. Yeah. Is way like
it's pretty out of whack.
It's way out of proportion from what we've seen in our own data. But it's going to vary by game. It's going to vary. It's going to vary so much all of the time that the thing that I'm allergic to is just the idea that like influencer marketing is the way to go. It's just like I think that's not true on average. As with anything, there are special cases. There are people who are particularly good at it. There are games that are particularly primed for it. Yep. Yeah, and so it's nothing is one size fits all. But I think given the expense of that kind of marketing, I think it's dangerous to recommend that too, especially indies with their extremely limited budgets.
Yeah, just make a really good game and hope for the best. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DeCoster for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate to support the podcast, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost up the charts and help it have a successful launch, and we would appreciate it. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.